decade is the need to incorporate some climate resilience into our marine infrastructure. So, and and then we have had a commitment to provide commercial fishing access from that facility to commercial fishermen for loading traps and for unloading their gear and accessing their boats. And then we also provide access for recreational boating. And then I think everybody would also agree there's been an interest in improving and expanding the parking situation down there. So the challenges, and I say the #1 challenge, and Weston and Sampson got to see it the first day they arrived, is everything that goes on down there at the Stone Pier makes it incredibly congested, particularly in the summertime during its period of maximum use. So ferry, barging, commercial fishing, recreational boating, school transportation, and then emergency services too. So we are experiencing what we call nuisance flooding during high tides occasionally. So super high tides, we will get water right up to the top of the pier. Then anybody who was here in January 24 is very much aware of what happened during that storm, where the pier was overtopped by several feet of water. Parking is it's a problem, but I will say it's a problem for most, ferry, marine infrastructure, shoreline, transport areas. We're not the only ones with parking challenges. 200 years old, and it was, built for a different purpose at the time, but it has stood the test of time partly because of its construction. Cost is going to be a big much keeping the footprint of here with the exception of adding a pedestrian walkway to the north side. And oops.
Trying my best with this, sorry.
So it's a little hard to see, but just to the north above the dotted line, that's the pedestrian walkway that was actually built out beyond the existing pier and was, going to have a railing and kind of be a very segregated area for pedestrians to traverse. And the advantage of, they also were moving the access from the ferry landing up to the wider part of the pier, and that would allow for 2 80-foot ramps. There was pretty much a circular transportation traffic flow, adding a few parking spaces, relocating the commercial fishermen to the north end of the pier. That had some challenges, and I would say was not fully resolved. But one of the benefits of this particular design is there was no need to access sort of the neck or the upper portion of the pier, which a lot of us do right now, and back up and unload and load. So the idea was you can load much closer to the wider part of the pier. On the next slide, it's the second option, primary option that they came up with, and that is a build out to the north and to the south, or east to the west, whichever way you want to call it, of the pier to basically expand the footprint. That allowed for, a much better traffic flow and a real true circular pattern of traffic flow. And those cars are to scale, so that gives you some idea of how many cars you could have kind of queuing up in terms of, the traffic. Then it created some additional parking spaces for a total of 89 or 90 parking spaces, accommodated 80-foot ramps, and again, no need to access the upper part of the neck of the pier. So that was, we finished that up in 2018. Then there was an interest in the community to look at the Sunset site. So there was a lot of discussion. We ended up hiring the same consultant to sort of do a similar assessment of the Sunset site. So on the next slide. Sorry, before we get there, I just wanted, this is important, so that these were 2018 dollars in terms of cost estimates. And so on the next slide, Vika, the estimates back in 2018 were about 2 million for the pedestrian walkway build out, for about 6.5 for the big pier expansion. And then there was, some suggested improvements to the barge or boat ramp. And those in both cases would be about 300,000. But bear in mind that that was some time ago that those estimates were developed. So on the next slide, we're going to move into Sunset. I get it, Bob. Now I got it. Bob's doing it simultaneously here. But anyway, so Sunset is an undeveloped site that the town of Cumberland purchased. I can't remember when, but for the purpose of providing shorefront access and potentially a future landing site for the ferry. And there was quite a bit of work done by the Sunset Committee prior to this study. And then in 2018, after the Stone Pier project was completed, the same consultant did an assessment of the Sunset Port property. And there were two options. One was a much more significant pier and had a different configuration of the pier that was a fairly expensive in those days. It was, over $10 million. So when the select board looked at option 2 as being sort of the more viable option financially, that option had an 18-foot pier that you couldn't drive down. So you basically would have foot access to that pier, and maybe also an ambulance would be able to get down there. 2 80-foot ramps, much more parking, 124 cars with a possible expansion to something like 200 cars. Big advantage of that site was an all-tide barge ramp, but no commercial or recreational boat facilities, which would have meant that we have to maintain 2 facilities, both the Stone Pier and the Sunset Landing. And I think people are familiar. If we move on to the next slide, the estimates for these, again, in about 2018 dollars. The first option, which I didn't display here, was up to 15 million. Option 2, which is what that image was depicting, was anywhere from 6.5 to 7.5 million. And if we just went with a boat and barge ramp, that was about $2.4 million. Yep, next slide. So after all of these studies were done, there was a lot of dialogue in the community. The select board decided to sort of have a community workshop and a real process to kind of make a decision about which site we were going to pursue, because we were really kind of in a quandary. We had to decide which one the community would pursue. The other thing was, at the same time, some of you may remember, the Army Corps of Engineers was working through sort of the dredging project, and there was a little hesitancy on the Army Corps when they heard we were looking at a second site, because they didn't want to make the investment in the Stone Wharf site if we were in fact going to move to another site. So it was a point where we felt as a community we needed to decide what we were going to do. So the select board did a series of workshops. They all ranked their priorities. They had a community workshop in February of 2020. And then on the next slide, there was a non-binding referendum. So this was just to get the community buy-in by, secret ballot. There was an election in March of that year. So they took advantage of that and did this referendum at the time. And we can see that there was a pretty overwhelming support for staying at the Stone Wharf, some support for Sunset Landing. So the reason the select board did this back in the spring of 2020 was to, the goal was to then the next step would be to create a warrant article for town meeting in June of 2020 to fund an engineering design for the site. And so the select board went through this process. We got the referendum completed. And then on the next slide, you might all remember what happened in March of 2020. And it took us a while because we all went back through the records and we're trying to figure out, like, why didn't we do anything? Well, then we remembered. So we really, as a town, we got preoccupied with just sort of our general survival out here, trying to get back and forth on the ferry. So you know, it was at least the whole year and probably into 2021 that we were really not, this was not on our priority list in terms of, you know, what we could spend time on. So that was a bit of a some lost time, frankly, most communities. So on the next slide, it was then in actually the spring of 21 when we sort of came back alive. And the select board hired Wright Pierce, Barney Baker, and the Schoenwald engineering firm to do a stone wharf assessment and a preferred design, preferred alternative design. So they first went into the stone wharf assessment, which was really mostly sort of a structural assessment of the stone wharf. You know, what kind of repairs need to be made? Is the stone wharf, you know, does it have enough integrity to support, you know, some kind of additional structures that could raise it above its current elevation, and to look at sort of its overall climate resiliency. Then in February of 2022, they expanded the scope a little bit to do some more public engagement, and then to actually come up with some alternative design and concept design and some cost estimates. So this is a little bit of a, you know, an iteration on what Collins did back in 2018. So there was a preferred design alternative that came out of this, and on the next slide, many of you will probably remember, this is the design that Wright Pierce came up with. This had an expansion of the pier to the north of about 9,000 square feet, an improved circular traffic flow, designated drop-off and pickup, increased parking up to 90 spaces, 2 8-foot ramps, designated pedestrian access to the golf tee. And one of sort of the major departures from some of the other designs was the addition of a commercial fishing pier shown in red that juts out from adjacent to the bar. So that was what they came up with in August of 2022. So next slide. The basis for, you know, so they came up with a cost estimate, $15.7 to $18 million. And they provided this table on options for, you know, the elevation that we could design the wharf to, but no real specific recommendations. The design, the construction of what they were proposing was a pretty substantial sort of concrete structure on top of the stone wharf. They did determine through their studies that the wharf had enough structural stability to take that static loading. But it was, you know, that was a pretty, I think it also, from what I understand, that's a project that would have to be done primarily in sort of one fell swoop. But when we looked at the cost definitely caused us to pause, because for us to take on a $15 to $18 million project, along with all the other projects we have, you know, that is, I think, really not feasible for this community. And the other thing is the decision on the design elevation of a new wharf is key. It affects the cost, it affects, you know, when it's usable, when it's not. It's a risk decision, it's a cost risk-based decision. And so we thought, well, so that's, if we go on to the next slide. Oh, yeah, so pop back for a second. So this was where we stopped in terms of our efforts on the stone pier. And I think Bob and I had been just coming on to the select board at that time. And so we, you know, I really had concerns about this cost. And frankly, it's hard to conceptualize what that much money might mean over the long run. But we would have had to bond a good portion of that money. And I think one estimate that we had is that it would have added about $1 million to the town budget for the bonded cost every year for 30 years. And so that's our budget right now is
Around 4 million.
around 4 million. So it will be a 25% increase in our budget. And I think at that point it might have been 1 million. So we had to kind of regroup as the board to figure out where we would go from here. So on the next slide, I just wanted to kind of introduce a couple of the other things that kind of have a bearing on how we got to where we are now. So one of the things was that, and it was really progressing over COVID, but people maybe weren't aware, but the Army Corps project was moving forward rather slowly, but the Army Corps was ready to start dredging the channel at the Stone Pier. And this is kind of a go, no-go decision for the community, because once we establish and commit to that dredging channel, I mean, that's going to be for perpetuity. And so I think the project was basically to dredge that channel 100-foot wide, and it extends out into the deep water just off of Shabby. And as you know, we were having canceled boats and limited boats because of problems with low water. So there was a lot of pressure both from CTC and the public to do this dredging project. So the cost of that project was a little more, I don't know exactly, we don't know yet what the total cost is, but over $2 million. To date, the town's portion of the cost is about $384,000, but we're still waiting to hear about the final payment. But the benefit of this is, despite the one-time cost, so, you know, in the future, going forward, the Army Corps will continue to maintain that channel at no cost to the town. So that's a big thing. And we did bond a portion of that with 250,000, which is pretty good considering. So we have been saving for that project, and we were able to put some money that we had in the bank towards the project. So that finished up, we got right in December of 23. We pretty much, last winter, we really finished up. It was done in 2 phases, but we finished up the dredging project. So that's good news, and that's done. So the other thing that we've kind of dealt with on the next slide, on and off for the past decade, as everybody's aware, is the golf course property. There's been a lot of interest in the community about potentially accessing that property for parking and for additional parking. And there's been a number of discussions with the golf course about that. And they're ongoing. And Bob can tell you a little bit more maybe about where things are at now, but we have not ever entered into any permanent agreement that I'm aware of with the golf course. So that's a part of the puzzle. And then the next slide is, you might remember, those of you who are here in 2017, that in order to construct the parking lot down there, we had to rezone the parcel, the golf course parcel. And it went to town meeting and it was voted down. But having been there for the discussion, my recollection was the reason it was voted down, not because people are opposed to rezoning the property, but they felt it should be part of an integrated project. So I believe that was the sentiment at the time. And it wasn't that people are opposed to using that parcel, but rather that it needs to be part of a complete program. So on the next slide, the last thing, the sort of last component that I'll mention is, as we all are desperate for, improvements to Wharf Road. And in 2022, the town hired CB Maher engineers to come up with a couple different designs. You know, both angle parking and I think parallel parking on Wharf Road on one side of the road, and widening the road to allow passage of 2 cars instead of us having to drive as we do now on the shoulder of the road. So those are all the different pieces. And so as a select board, we really felt it was important that we take all of those pieces and kind of put them together in one comprehensive integrated project, because you need to know what you're going to do at the wharf to do some of the road work. If the golf course parking is going to happen, that could affect what we need to do on the Stone Pier. So they all kind of relate to one another. So that was really where we landed about in 2022 or early 23, that we kind of need to look at the project in its entirety with all of these components. So from there, I think, and the last slide is just to give people an idea of how much money we've spent and where we spent it. And so we've spent about $680,000, but more than half of that is the dredging cost. So, other than that, we were pretty successful in, getting grants to cover a lot of the conceptual design work that we did. And, so I think, you know, we were successful in getting over $100,000 worth of grants over that time frame. So, but those are the projects that we've done from basically 2016 through 2024. So from here, we're going to hand it over to Weston and Sampson. And so they were hired by the town, by the Board of Selectmen, to basically look at the project and to kind of answer some of these questions. And the primary questions we had were sort of looking at the overall design, and also a pretty fundamental thing was looking at what we call the design elevation, or how high we would recommend the construction be either now or in the future. And so we'll let them give their presentation next.
Sam Moffett from Weston and Sampson. We've been very pleased to be supporting the town with this project. I've been serving as the principal in charge for Weston and Sampson. We're a 125-year-old engineering and architecture firm with a lot of experience with coastal resiliency projects recently. So just wanted to say hello myself. I've got with me here Christine Player of Weston and Sampson, who's going to lead you through the first part of this presentation. Bosma from Woods Hole Group, who's our sub-consultant for the coastal market. So I'll hand it off to Christine.
Hi, are we ready to go? I'm Christine Player from Weston and Sampson. And just to kind of give a quick brief overview, project team, as you know, we've got Bob and Hill from the town. And then our team consisted of Weston and Sampson as the lead consultant, and Kirk Bosma, who's sitting up front here, from the physical group as our modeling expert. So this image looks familiar. Carol brought everyone back a few years to kind of see how we got where we are today. And this all relates back to the final draft preferred alternative from Wright Pierce. Again, the dollars, as Carol mentioned, were exorbitant, and it led the town to pause and really rethink what do we need to gather all of this information to develop a cost-effective and an adaptable approach, understanding this isn't just go in, construct, and leave. It's about looking at sea level rise and climate change impacts, but also finding a pathway forward over time to implement those. So we separated our approach into immediate improvements, and that would prioritize and focus on public safety and access and walking. And then we have a near-term improvement grouping where we would extend the immediate improvements so that we have serviceability through the next 20 to 25 years. And then the last piece would be moving into a long-term improvement mode, and that would extend serviceability at the Wharf up to the next 50 years. A little overview of how we got involved. We were awarded a contract by the town in 2023. The original scope that we provided our services under was for $75,000. And once the team was aboard, we worked with the town to really fine-tune the scope to make sure that what we were providing the town really supported advancement and implementation of something. And that something would be an immediate something, near-term, and long-term. And again, going back to this idea of adaptability, what we build today, we can continue to add like Lego building blocks over time. And that would be done in a very cost-conscious approach. As Carol mentioned earlier, we're looking at a lot of money to get to the final finish line. So that cost consciousness is very important so that we phase our approach. So not only does it accomplish the goals of the improvements, but it's done so it's affordable and that the town can budget accordingly. And then lastly, looking at opportunities that are out there. There are a lot of steps as we move this project forward. The scope, the deliverables, all align with resiliency, adaptability to climate change, so that we can qualify for grant funding. So our scope of services were really divided into two pieces, and that was to develop conceptual improvements is to develop a set of conceptual improvements, again, immediate, near term and long term, and then to do more of the technical coastal modeling assessments that are required to really understand not just sea level rise, but the climate change in terms of waves and storm events and all of those things that are happening in a dynamic mode. So we hired Woods Hole Group to assist us with that. That's our area of expertise. And that would give us the future flood protection or resiliency recommendations so that we could now move towards the next steps of the project. The project scope was completed August 2024. And a couple of just things to mention along the way is Woods Hole Group. We were waiting, the state concurrently is moving forward with developing a statewide flood risk model. And the idea was to utilize data that we would need for to model the town's stone wharf. We were waiting to share that data. Unfortunately, getting that data from the state was delayed considerably. So in the end, there was a decision back in December to modify our scope so that we can actually do the bathymetric survey that is required to plug into the model. So that was performed in February 2024, and that allowed us to not wait for the state, but to move forward. Next slide. So phase one is really trying to focus on near-term immediate improvements that can be done without having to look at zoning changes, without having to look at any other land other than what's owned by the town and the immediate boundary of the town. And through this configuration that you see, safety improvements would be gained by creating in the orange there. You can see a 5 to 8 foot wide pedestrian path. The loading and drop off area would be multi-car. We would paint signage, we would paint and add signage to literally separate pedestrian separation from some of the other activities. And then there is the possibility of adding an emergency staging area. In addition, there would be 49 parking spaces. That would include 9 ADA designated spaces, and temporary drop-off lanes would reduce by 12. There'd be a vehicle turnaround. It's hard to see in the image, but it's kind of that white shadowy area. That would be 1 lane. The working areas, again, a lot of multi-use conflicts going on here. The working areas would be separated. Cargo vehicle access would be designated, and then there would be bicycle storage beside it. Traffic would be allowed to flow for cars, trucks, and school buses. And through this configuration, we could also have the potential to expand pedestrian pathway access along Stone Wharf. And then we could also put some physical and visual separations from traffic, looking at ADA, additional ADA parking, and then potential off-site parking that come through a shuttle service. The second phase would be expanded parking. And that parking in a parking area would come through an acquisition through the golf course. That would add extended pedestrian pathways out to the northeast. And then it would also add an additional 53 parking spaces. However, 6 would be lost from the first phase to create the parking lot entrance. So in the end, when you add phase 1 to phase 2 improvements, you'd have a total of 96 total parking spaces. There would also be capacity for additional parking spaces. Parking could be separated with planters. We could get creative and get some stormwater runoff improvements as part of this, and then also look at that roadway widening that was proposed in the earlier study along Stone Wharf. Other possibilities that could be integrated into this phase 2 would to look at parking lot reconfiguration to support other types of vehicles. And this is all kind of connected to the land acquisition piece. Look at parking needs and funding availability, and then to add off-site parking with shuttle services we talked about under phase 1. And then lastly, we added this phase. It was kind of a moment coming here to visit folks. And that was just this idea of what if a second wharf structure was constructed, and that would be off to the northeast of the stone wharf. And really what this would achieve is eliminating these multi-use conflicts that everybody sees out there. It's a busy place, and this would allow to have a second landing spot that you could start segregating your uses so you don't have the conflicts that you see today. The second wharf location, as you see it in the crosshatch here, that would connect to the parking lot that would be constructed on phase 2, which is in 2 and it would accommodate spaces for trucks and passenger cars. With this option, and again, this is just an idea for the future, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We need to look at climate conditions, we have to look at resiliency measures, we've got issues with permeability, we have to identify all the coastal resource areas that may be impacted by construction of the second wharf. We need to understand subsurface conditions, tidal conditions, cover bottom conditions, and then we have to look at the benefit cost analysis. So again, this is really just kind of an initial pass of an idea that could be considered for the future. And as part of our scope, we did, after the storm in January 2024, our structural crew came out to do a visual inspection of the wharf. Through this effort, Wright Pierce back in 2022, as part of their study, had put monitoring points along the entire wharf structure. And we came out and we reshot those through survey just to monitor the condition. Through that effort, we did notice at the ferry landing that there's a bow in the wall. And we did notice through our monitoring points that there appears to have been a little bit of movement. Now, the Wright Pierce study did show the bow in the wall initially, but our survey points show that there has been some shifting at the top of the wall. However, the recommendations of our study was additional investigations are required to look into that. But this is kind of a heads up. This is a heads up to think about in the next steps forward, doing more analysis to evaluate the structural integrity of the wharf. And I think that's my last slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Kurt.
Thanks, Christine. Good evening, everybody. I'm a coastal engineer from Woods Hole Group down in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Woods Hole Group is a marine environmental consulting firm. We do a lot of work with NOAA on a national level, monitoring water levels, real-time data for ships, and then also do a lot of coastal engineering. We design a lot of stuff in Boston to be more flood resilient. We're working a lot on climate change factors, and so we're bringing that here to treat. One of the primary goals that we're focused on here is if we are going to refurbish the existing stone wharf at any level, how high should it be? Right? There's a lot of uncertainty. We've seen flooding out there, right? This year, sometimes even during high tides, it probably gets really close, right? During storm events, you have this situation. But there's a lot of uncertainty associated with what's going to happen in the future. So what we're really digging into here is how to really get into that. One of our bigger projects that I'm working on is are working right now for Maine DOT. We're doing a flood risk model for the entire state of Maine. That's looking at what the flood risks are for all communities along the coastline and the entire state. We've done that for the state of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, as well as Florida. It's a physics-based approach, and what that means is we're not just adding numbers up, we're actually looking at how the water physically moves. Because if you look here, one of those numbers up there, those are the sea level rise projections for the state of Maine. So that's just you're adding some value, right, for the water level. If you just add up numbers, like filling up your bathtub at home, right? You can fill up your bathtub a little higher, the water comes up a little higher. That's great if the water was really quiet all the time, right? And so a lot of the stuff you see online, when you go down online and use the sea level rise viewer, right? You move the little slider bar up and down and it gets more blue over the land. That's all what we call a bathtub type approach, which is just a very flat water surface elevation, right? I don't know about you, but when I go out to the ocean, it's not really flat. And it's especially not flat when you have a coastal storm event. And so the way I usually explain it is I fill my bathtub at home, it's pretty flat water surface elevation. I go grab my 4-year-old, Hurricane Jackson, I put Hurricane Jackson in the tub, and it is not a flat water surface elevation. There's water flying out at me, everything's happening, right? So we're bringing that idea, right? And a lot of what you'll see with the online viewers and stuff, it's a good first order approximation. But if you're talking about significant money to design something, you want to get the actual physical effects of water into that. And that's what we're doing for the state. So we're in that process of doing that modeling right now for the whole state. Point is, that state standard that we helped develop for them is being applied here. So even though we're not done, you're already set up to be in line with what the state is going to recommend and what the state is doing. So we're a little bit ahead for the island than the rest of the state. That's okay. Sea level rise projections, those numbers there, based on those planning processes, there's a commit to manage level, okay? And then there's a prepare to manage. Just gonna spend just 1 second trying to explain what those mean. So, you know, if you go out to 2030 or 2050, that's obviously when they expect that occur. But those are projections. The commit to manage is based on an emission scenario. That means the world does a little bit better managing carbon emissions than we do now. So the rate might slow. The prepare to manage scenario is the globe again, kind of continues as, you know, standard procedures of today. So we just kind of keep doing what we're doing. So it's a little bit higher projection. Now, are these certain? They have pretty good, scientists have a pretty good idea by 2030, 2050 might be in that ballpark. But when you get out to 2100 levels, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? It could be better. There's a lot of factors that come into play. Ice melts, expands, all these things. So those are the planning level effects. And as I mentioned, that's just the additive value of the sea level going up, right? Again, now you want to add the physics on top of it. So what are those additional variables? We're looking at how that deeper water changes your tidal conditions. What happens when you actually get a storm, right? Do you think, right, if you have shallower water and you get a storm, or if you have deeper water and you get a storm, that the storm would be a little bit different? It's going to be a little bit different with deeper water. Why? Because it can take more energy, right? So the deeper the water gets, energy starts to pick up. And then there's a lot of work done on the changing storm frequency intensity. We're bringing that into the picture too. So our storms actually getting more intense, more frequent over time. Okay. And then we brought in waves here too. Okay. So waves are a big part of what you have when you're talking about coastal infrastructure, wharfs, piers, those types. So all that kind of stuff is built into determining these correct elevations to use. All right. So to help us figure that out, we use coastal models. And what that means is we're using the governing equations of how water moves, which have been studied since the 1800s. And we're saying, well, we got now these big fancy computers that can calculate a whole bunch of stuff really quickly. And so we have the bathymetry information, which is basically what the elevation is under the water, just like elevations on land, topography. Bathymetry is elevations under the water. We were lucky enough to wait till after the board and their dredging, so we have that information built into the model. And then we look at wave generation. How do waves come into the Stone Wharf? We spend a lot of time looking at the waves here, and I tried really hard to get big waves in there. And that red arrow is kind of oceanic generation of waves, and then the yellow arrows are what local winds kind of generate. It was really hard to get a really big wave at the Stone Wharf. So one thing I'll say is that spot is pretty good. I don't know who decided that, what old timer decided that that Stone Wharf was a place to do, but I really tried to knock that thing over. I couldn't get the waves in there that you really need. It's lasted a long time. So it's a good location in terms from that perspective. And then we look at how those waves transform. So we generate them and then we bring them in, and I'll show you in a second, into the Stone Wharf. I mentioned the main coastal flood risk model. We're doing that for the whole state. We're using that information, sea level rise, storm intensity, and storm surge. That all gets brought into this so that we can give you the appropriate level. You know, when Hurricane Jackson's there making trouble to design this Stone Wharf. Next slide. Oh, sorry.
It's very close to your lips.
I want to see this too close. Okay, so this slide has got a lot of information on it, so we'll try to walk through it real quickly here. One of the things that we do when we talk about design elevation right, is, I already mentioned, we're trying to include all those relevant processes that affect you when you live on the water, when you live on the ocean, right? We're looking at elevations designed for both non-storm and storm conditions, right? So in normal sunny day, everyday conditions, what do you have to deal with now and in the future, right? So that's things like tides, annual type conditions. And then what do you deal with when you deal with storms? So we're providing information on both of those two, right? Really, really key for anything that you're doing nowadays. It used to be the case where you pick a design condition, right? Whether you're building a road, bridge, a building, earthquake loads, right? Well, we're going to design for a 100-year condition. Great. Here's that, and whatever. Level 4 earthquake. Here's what we have in terms of loading. That's not the way engineering works anymore, because we're dealt a changing condition. So you can't just pick something and say, I'm designing this, right? What we're dealing now with is the design processes, the design forcing mechanisms are changing over time. Right? We see that in the actual data, right? So water's getting deeper. So I can't just pick something and say, well, this is what it's designed to, and expect it to be static that whole way, right? So flexible design approaches are really, really critical. And that's what we're trying to do here, where we're providing a minimum level and then something that you always want to go to in terms of adaptive. And try to unpack that just a little bit more. So we might say, hey, let's go up 3 feet, right? But we want you to be able to go up to 5 feet in the future. We don't like to do that now because it's really expensive, and we really don't know if it's going to go up to 5 by this certain time. Maybe it takes, 50 years, maybe it's 100 years, right? But we want to make sure that when you design that 3-foot increase, you don't box yourself in, and you're not allowed to go to that 5 feet or can't go to that 5 feet in the future, right? So every design, and I'll push Weston and Sampson really hard on this, they have to be flexible in terms of, you go to 3, but I want you to be able to get to 5, right? So at some point in the future, because if you can't do that, that causes the problem. And we don't want to do it today because we don't know for sure that's what's going to happen. So now we can monitor the water, and we can decide when we get to a certain trigger point or a certain level, we might need to go from 3 to 5. But guess what? You're already set up in your design to easily do that. Does everybody understand that? This is a really important part of what we're trying to do. Okay. So these levels you can do for the, Christine just showed you that, kind of the existing stone wharf and then maybe a new pier wharf. These levels can be applied to either or both of those. Okay. So the green, for example, would be, hey, I want to make sure that this new system, the new wharf, the new pier, doesn't flood under any type of normal sunny day condition. What do I mean by that? So every day out to 2070, right? I'm not going to see water over my wharf. It means I can use it. I can use it whether I'm a fisherman, contractor, a resident, school children going to school, right? But if I got a storm, it's going to go over the top. Maybe that's okay as long as it doesn't get destroyed, right? You can, maybe it doesn't, you don't want to use it during a storm event, so the water goes over in a storm. So that's a 1.5 foot increase, which is that green line there. That guy there, he's a 6 foot guy. That's what size, right, Bob? Yeah, it's Bob's on the wharf, right? And so 1.5 feet is that green line, that's where you're going to go. Okay. Just so you know, that blue line is a present day mean high water, the lower one, and then the present day highest annual tide is that upper one. Okay. Those are your normal kind of tidal conditions, not in storm. Right. Now let's say, well, there's some uncertainty in those projections, right? We don't know what China's going to do with emissions. We can't control the whole globe. Then you're talking about a 4 foot increase for normal tidal conditions. Okay, so that's the yellow. So if you're a little bit more conservative, right? You say, we don't want water to flood again under normal sunny day conditions. It's okay. We're not going to use it during a storm. We're not going to be out there. If the water goes over, it's okay. That would be the sunny day. That's the yellow. Now, if we bring storms into the picture, just brought a 100-year return period storm. So that's a pretty big event, right? 1% chance each year. 5.1 feet would be the commit to manage level. And then 7.7 feet, which is the blue, would be the prepare manage level. What is that? That would be a level where you're like, I'm not getting wet enough. During a storm, you're not getting parked. Right, so if you wanted a all-time access pier wharf system, right, you would go up to that 5 to 7.7 miles. That means a storm comes in, you're still high. You could use it, you could access it. Now, if you have two wharfs, right, you could mix and match those, right? So maybe the storm wharf, you say, hey, that's going to be my everyday use thing. I'm going up to that sunny day level. And about the new one later on, I don't have to build it right now. I'm going to make that storm zone. So that one will be high, right? They both could serve various purposes. That could all be determined, but there's flexibility built into that approach. Okay, so those are those levels. Next slide. Just to give you a little bit more concept, this is just a rough visualization of what this looks like, right? So the truck is on there for scale. And if you go slowly through this, right? It just like the next slide,
Okay.
right? This would be that 1.5 increase. That's what that would look like. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean this would be the design, right? I'm just sticking with the existing granite block build here. So one more. Now you're getting some pretty serious 4-foot increase. Right, next slide. It's a 5. Next one. Now you're up to 7.7. So that gives you just some sense of what kind of levels we're talking about. And again, you could mix this with a second pier wharf. That would be, maybe that one would be the one that you're starting fresh. We're going up high if we need to. It's like the state pier is right on the island. And that would be, you know, more of the storm emergency access. So that gives you some idea of how we come up with this design. The last thing we did was we started the process of looking at this actual second pier wharf, right? So we have to do this to assess the efficacy of how we work and also from a permitting perspective. So this is a model that we developed for that. You can see we're looking at the reflection, wave transformations that come in. All those lines are wave crests and troughs. So servers really like this model because they can look at where the crests and the troughs are of the waves. But what we're doing here is focused on, okay, if I put this new thing in there that's not been in there before, what is it going to do to waves? Right? Because we can't mess up erosion along the shoreline somewhere, how the sediment moves. So this is how we started this. We set it up at this level. What we can do with this now is change the configuration of things, whether it's the existing stone wharf or the new pier. We can lay it out differently. We can try things and see how that affects the physical process of waves. We can also put in things like wave attenuators or wave fences like we have out there now, if we need to reduce wave heights in certain situations. So this was a critical part of the model we built under this because we had some extra funds to really do this in this stage. That will help us going forward with the design. This also provides design parameters for the design team when they actually lay stuff out. Things like wave forces on structures, stability of the structure during storm events, those types of things. So that was the last piece of it. Slide. And then, I'm not doing this part. Where do we go from here? Handing over to my new friend Tom.
Thanks. So we're going to talk just a little bit about next steps for the town, and then we'll go back, we'll open it up to questions. I want to point out that a lot of the technical slides that we saw, the imagery that we saw, is a very, very small slice of what the select board has seen. And we will make all of that detailed data, all that detailed imagery available on the town website. We'll print off copies at the town office if anybody would like to see it on paper. And we have access to them tonight once we get into the questions phase of things. And Kirk and the Weston Sampson team can answer questions with a better set of more detailed data and images as we get into the questions. So where do we go from here as a town? Next steps, first let's put on the right glasses so I can read. We need to review and consider questions and feedback that come out of this workshop. And we hope there'll be quite a bit of that. Thanks again. We need to finalize our conversations with the golf course. So as some of you know, that golf course conversation has been ongoing. And the feedback that we got the last time we talked about the golf course at town meeting, which as Carol pointed out was a zoning question, that got rejected not based on zoning objections, but because of the desire to tie all of these different projects together to include not just the level rise, but design flood elevation, to include the widening of the road, to include the safety improvements at the stone pier, in a logical fashion. We do now have a draft memo of understanding with the golf course, and it's still a draft, but we've been working with them closely, and they've expressed interest in working with the town to move forward on that land transfer. A lot more work to do there, but we really appreciate their community spirit in moving forward. Another next step will be to finalize a phased approach. So as you watched what Weston and Sampson and what Kirk from Woods Hole presented, there's a lot of elements of improvement out there. And what you've seen in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 is one way of delivering those improvements over time. As we get into permitting, as we learn more about funding, we can, to some degree, slice and dice some of those improvements and combine them in different ways. As long as we continue to keep our core principles on this project of flexibility, adaptability, and modular design going forward. We have recently received a $75,000 grant from the Maine Infrastructure Adaptation Fund that we will be using for the development of a 30% design. In the world of federal funding, which in cases like this project is usually, if not always, administered in Maine through the Department of Transportation, a critical requirement before you can really have serious conversations about funding is getting to a 30% design level. So that's a critical next step, is moving forward on a 30% design of phase 1 or of phase 1 and phase 2. That's what we need to figure out, and that's what we'll be designing for. And that should be a fairly short-term project to get to a 30% design level. Most of you know that we were given good news from the offices of Senator Collins and Representative Pingree back in the early days of the current budget, that both of them put the requests that we put out there for funding for the stone pier on their list to be approved, and they have moved those through their committees. That's the good news. The less than stellar news is that the congressional budget is still in the early phases of sausage making, let's call it. The most recent change was a continuing resolution, which basically gets us past the election. It's unclear whether we will need to resubmit those applications, whether they will simply resubmit them within their committees. They can't answer those questions until more is known about how Congress is going to eventually come together to approve a budget for the current fiscal year and soon the upcoming fiscal year. We'll stay in touch with those two offices on that front. Those two awards totaled right at $2 million, aimed at the public safety and traffic aspects of the stone pier in light of sea level rise, designing for appropriate elevation relative to sea level rise. We need to meet and coordinate with the DOT. We've had several meetings with the Department of Transportation to date, but as we kick off the 30% design project, and then as we go through that, we'll need to stay in touch with the DOT on a regular basis. Again, they're critical. Their stamp of approval, their support is critical as these funds get administered. And lastly, at some point in the not too distant future, we'll need to have a town meeting, at which the select board would come to the town with a suggestion of design flood elevations, and the citizens of the town can then vote to approve that selected design flood elevation or not. And also for the town at town meeting to be involved in setting that path forward. Is it phase 1 and then we stop? Is it phase 1 followed quickly by phase 2? That kind of conversation. One note about that, we've seen examples in Maine recently of federal fund designations that were awarded to towns where then the project did not get support at town meeting, where the town in some cases actually voted down the matching funding that was required on various projects. Freiburg is a recent example where they lost, I think it was $3 million or $5 million, $4 million that was awarded to them with CDS money and earmark money. And they lost that $4 million because they couldn't come together. So it's going to be important that we have the kind of conversations as a community that allow us to come together. And with that, questions. Thank you so much for waiting to this point.
So we just want to let people know what's this.
Right. Yes, so Weston Sampson will be leaving at 7:45. We've got 45 minutes. We've got a good bit of
No, I
time here.
just want
Yeah, so I'm gonna give control of the slide deck back to Vika. I'm going to ask for questions and then refer the questions to the appropriate people to answer them as we move forward. So again, thank you for holding your questions until the end. And with that, does anybody have any questions? With that, please step up and stand to the Vika's left.
Bet we need to see some more pictures, but I'm just curious how the road elevates to get to the elevated pier and how that integrates with the golf course.
Good question. It's not answered yet. And the reason it's not answered yet is they haven't selected the line flood elevation to which we're going to commit. So if we decide as a community that we want to raise the stone pier to the commit to manage phase for 2070, then that indicates a certain height of the stone pier into which Wharf Road needs to taper downhill and then flat into. So as a community, we will need to go up the design to decide what we want to do with the stone pier in terms of DFE. We now have all the information we need to have an intelligent conversation about that. And then the road can be designed as well as the parking area can be designed at that appropriate elevation.
Thank you.
Good question. Other questions? Yeah. You need to come up here. Yes.
Actually, about you, if I can stand this out.
I'll keep this one. Yep.
Yeah, so you're.
There we go. You can sit and then pass it to the next person.
All right, and you may have said this, or I may not have understood, but have we determined that the stone pier can go up 7 feet or more safely as is, or does that need to be widened, or?
Good question. Good question.
Answer that?
Go ahead, Christie.
I don't know if I need a microphone.
Speak loud.
It helps for the people.
Here.
So we are looking at these design flood elevations, and obviously that decision has been made yet. Part of the next steps, once that flood elevation, design flood elevation has been selected, then we have to do some more investigations and engineering to confirm that the existing structure doesn't have any limitations on how high that can be raised. So that would be a next step. But the first most important step, as Bob alluded to, is really identifying what that design flood elevation is going to be, and then we move on from there.
I would add intuitively, we know that it's going to be harder for the stone pier to stand up to a 7-foot addition in height than it would be to add a 3-foot addition to height. We can surmise that it would be more costly to make that base strong enough to support that additional 7 feet versus 3 feet. That's all part of the engineering work that needs to be detailed out. Once we select our path forward in terms of DFE and in terms of design flood elevation and in terms of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3.
And I would just like to add to that is the selection of that flood elevation obviously is addressing sea level rise climate change. But we also have to look at impacts on permeability, cost effectiveness, how do we change it so it becomes more cost effective. And the only other piece I would add to the question that you had about the roadway and tying in roadway, we also have to look at how we're tying in everything on the other side of the wharf, right? We've got the landing, the ferry landing, commercial landing. So all of that is a next step once the design flood, the DFE elevation is selected. And all of those pieces now have to be looked at, analyzed, but that balancing act becomes challenging. And that's what the next steps will bring to the forefront to the community to see where we can next.
Can you touch base more in terms of the recommendation for the second pier and the flexibility that you would have instead of investing larger amount of money elevating the stone pier 7 feet? You could potentially do it a couple of feet, have it be cost effective, use it on day-to-day basis, but then future raise the newer which would be cheaper to build than, and make it significantly higher.
Yeah, no, once we start seeing what the constraints are of the existing wharf, right, and then the DFE is decided upon, the idea of the second pier becomes kind of an intriguing piece of the puzzle. And that can achieve a couple of things. And that's the swapping off between the different uses and trying to isolate the uses so we eliminate some of those conflicts. But to Perk's slides that he was showing, a 1.5 to 4 foot raise of that wharf gets you sunny day, actually up near your storm almost, under the commit to manage. So it's a balancing act, and I think we'll be looking at those things to kind of find how you can piece that together. But the idea of a second pier, even though it's a future idea, introducing that opportunity to this project gives you more flexibility in how your operations will work. And then the cost effectiveness, right? Investing in a higher pier to achieve your storm events versus maybe some limitations and constraints that we may find out about the wharf in terms of how high that actually can be.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to that discussion. So, we talk about that sunny day level, but if you go up, right, that still buys you storm protection as well, right? It's not that it's just, if you go up 3 to 4 feet, that handles almost all of the storms today in the near term, right? So it buys you sunny day, like all the way out to 2070, but it also provides you a lot of storm protection as well. Currently, what the key to these climate change things, and we've done a lot of different coastal designs in various conditions. I can give you an example of what we did in Woods Hole for the Woods Hole Research Institute there in here. Buying time to see what really happens with sea level rise, like changing climate conditions, right? So you want to be very smart about how you're doing that process. So do I think you should go, just my own personal opinion, do I think you should go 7.7 feet up? No. I think you should be thinking about what level do I need to go to really get your most bang for your buck, given the uncertainty in the sea level rise projections going forward. So there's lots of good ways you can do that. That's what you really need to focus on.
Okay, other questions? Thanks, Kurt. Lyle.
Is the barging function included in the planning?
So the short answer to that is that the current level of barge activity is presumed to continue at that location. It's still one of the 4 or 5 elements of activity at the stone pier that create congestion from time to time. There's no plan in this project to increase the amount of barging at that location. There's also no plan to decrease barging. It would be in the same location in all plans that we've drawn. There's no plan with this project on the stone pier, which was entertained earlier, but which is problematic, especially when you look at the benefits of that recent dredging activity. So yes, it'll continue, but no, there's no plan to grow in this project. Thanks, Lila. Yes, sir.
Does this plan accommodate the possibility of,
Do you like the phone? Thank you. Thank you.
does this plan accommodate the possibility of a large barging issue down in Cone? What is it? Bennett Cove. Will this be able to address those issues?
No.
Okay, so we have a bit more.
So that's a separate project.
Yeah.
Project is underway, but yes, this plan does not address the issues that been. Other questions? Donna, and then Ted, sorry, Donna had hand up first. Oh, absolutely. We've been trying to control it, but failing.
Well, thank you for all this work. I know the board has worked really hard, and I know that the engineers have worked really hard. This has been, I counted about 54 years we've been having these studies of the storm. Just to put it in perspective, I'm not going to, Carol did a great job, I have to say, on the last 10 years. We're not going to go back more than 10 years. That'll be 10 years too long. I had a couple of questions though. One was, from my thinking about it, that the reason that the zoning was defeated at the Stone Wharf for the parking was because there was a real question over how many spaces you could actually get in that area. And part of the reason, and I don't know if you guys are familiar, you may have identified that the home body septic system is in there.
Yeah.
And that by the time we put a space around that, that took spaces and I just find that having worked on this for a long time, 54 seems like a lot of spaces to be able to get in that space. The other question or comment with that second wharf, it looks like it's coming off from the ledges in front of the homeowner's house. The town's property does not go all the way over there. So you would have to consider where the property line is before you actually, because, I'm not sure what they think, just keep that in mind. The bulge on the wharf shows up in pictures as early as 1900. So that bulge has been there for a long time. And, the fact that they're monitoring the movement, that's interesting, but it has been there for quite a long time. This, as two people have already mentioned, this doesn't solve our barging problem. And I think we have to be thinking about that. And I think we should be looking at a more global solution to some of our priorities. The straw poll that was taken in 2007 between Sunset and the Stone Wharf did not consider the cost associated with raising the Stone Wharf, the numbers that we had. And I think that people didn't have all of the information. It also did not include what the cost to develop the road. Those were two variables. They are probably not the same cost. And I just think that people need to understand what the context was when that decision was made. And if you're considering building a second wharf and you really want to solve the problems of parking, passenger service, and in addition, the barging, I really think we should revisit Sunset. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Donald. Hold on, I want to take further questions. Hold on a second. So let's see, Donna, you asked about their septic system. That is drawn in on those prints. It was not that easy to see up on the screen, but the easement for their septic system is drawn in. And the location, the tentative proposed theoretical location of a tentative proposed second pier, it does go off the ledge, but it does go off of the golf course land that is addressed in this draft memo of understanding. And then for the rest of your comments, thank you. So, Teddy, please.
Hi, like you said, Carol, that was excellent presentation. One other small part, you know, if you fit in the bathroom, just ask all of us. We live in the bathroom, we watch it here. The third thing is uses of the pier. This is very important. We're a city in Maine and we don't have a city street to the mainland. So a lot of people really depend on having their what we call wharf points at the pier. And I see that's kind of lumped in with recreation, which is a whole mess, which includes people coming to the hotel, which gets really wacky. And then, the overcrowding of people who need to get to the hospitals, commute on an on-ferry schedule, or just, exercise the right of being able to travel freely between town without being stuck on the ferry. So I just wanted to hope that you guys, it doesn't seem like consider that as one of the uses of the.
You can hand it to me, that would be great. You can hand it to the next person. So, good points, Teddy. The commuter use of hunts is definitely part of the plan. And I guess the best illustration of that we could offer is the direction on the board. And again, we're not deep into the survey yet, but we are paying attention to the feedback from the survey. But it's become important to us to consider the strategic relationship of what happens at Cousins and what happens at the Stone Pier. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, just as an example, to address sea level rise at the Stone Pier without considering sea level rise at Cousins. One of the potential solutions or improvements at Cousins, including an 80-foot double ADA oriented ramp, would also serve to, it would require a larger float and an additional dolphin and a larger float. There are several ideas from Coastal Waters Committee as to how that larger float could be configured to add even more space for those ponds. So not forgotten, definitely in the mix of issues to be considered, but thank you for bringing that. Other questions?
But you just answered my question. I was concerned about hazards.
Oh, okay. You can hand the mic to Beth, please.
I appreciate.
Beth, could you stand up so the camera can see you? I know you love it.
I appreciate all the work that you've done to finally do it together. I have a question for you. And it's my understanding that we have the money already to expand the Wyden Road. That's in our budget. Is that true? The Stone Wharf Road, we put that money aside for years and it is available now. Widening that is not true.
I believe the answer is no.
So there's no money in the budget for that.
There is money in the budget that has been set aside for paving town roads. And there is money in the budget that has been set aside for Stone Wharf, and Stone Wharf Road is within the description of that. So, but there hasn't been a specific X amount of hundreds of thousands of dollars set aside for just that.
Thank you. My other point is I see a lot of the golfers here that are part of our community. Families that have been here for years. And I really would appreciate if we could move on to getting that land. We've been, ditzing around with it for too long. And this is important. This is a community. I don't think you're making it a resort. But I think we need to work together, and I ask you to please consider getting this done for us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Beth. And I agree with everything Beth said. I would also add that the lack of forward motion on the golf course parking issue has more to do with the select board than it does to do with the golf course. We own that. That's on us. Other questions? John?
I'm just kind of curious and recognize all the engineering that's going into all this so far. I guess my question is, to what extent is the town willing to accept an occasional day or two of being underwater versus spending a lot of money to raise it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever?
Thanks, John. Great question.
So I think maybe we could ask Kurt to weigh in on that.
That'd be great.
He works with a lot of communities.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a number of things to consider in that question, which is a great question. The first thing you gotta decide is, how important access is under certain conditions, right? So I'm thinking emergency conditions, health conditions, right? You want to be able to get on and off in certain cases. As Carolyn has worked with a lot of communities, right? You can't go so high that you can't access the water, right? So you have a big tide range here, right? So at that low tide, you go up this much higher, almost you can't get water. So that's why I think flexibility in this approach is really, really, really important. It also speaks to the questions how long, right? So right now, yeah, it's an occasional storm, maybe a really high tide, not a big deal. That's changing, right? Pretty soon it's going to be, you get to the point where once a month you're underwater, right? Or God forbid every high tide. I'm not up here telling you that it's going to go up 7 feet in the next 10 years, right? Nobody knows that. Even if you think it is, But you need to be prepared and aware of what is actually happening so that you can adjust to that accordingly. So to me, being smart about it is really where you need to set, right? So I think right now, a lot of communities, again, depending on what the criticality is, we're doing tons of projects on resiliency that they don't have the ability to go up as high as they might want to, but they're going up a certain level, preparing to go further if needed, because their emergency activity or did not have a downtime in a specific road or a specific access point or a specific port. So I think that's the kind of the question you have to weigh. Now, what I can use to provide information, how often we expect the current stone wharf to be underwater over time, right? And that might help that decision a little bit more as well.
And I would just add that the Islesboro, so up the bay away, the Narrows, if you're familiar with Islesboro, there's a causeway between the Narrows that flood and goes underwater, so it's not a very landing, but it's the island gets split, and it's emergency access as they're concerned. And just recently, the select board told me they made the decision to not go as far as they want to go, but they're going to sort of a kind of the intermediate level, really because of cost. So they're moving it up so that they will have access during all, as Kirk said, probably all, kind of 2070 conditions, and recognizing that there may be storm conditions that they can't access. And I think the way they're going to approach it is to consider how they're going to manage their emergency services under more severe conditions. And we all know that there are times when, if you're in North Carolina right now, you're not maybe getting emergency services. So I think sort of part of this whole thing is disaster preparation and emergency services preparation. So I saw that our fire chief had a question, so I'm kind of
I guess my concern, would be the bad guy tonight. I'm tired of hearing about all these expansions and everything on parking and unfloats and everything. We have limited access, and I think we need to limit the access. I don't think
I think that is a community decision. And it's, how much parking do we feel is really essential? And then varies a lot from person to person. I'm in the not so much parking camp. And I think, we part of the problem is we don't have any public transportation or taxi service here. And we maybe should think about, would that help to reduce the parking at the Stone Pier? Would a bus system help reduce the parking at the Stone Pier? And I think we also have to realize things could be a lot different in 25 years in terms of how people are getting around. And so I think we need, we're in the here and now and maybe plan 25 years from now is maybe not very, correct. So anyway, I think there is the issue of parking today that we could perhaps manage better, but I think part of the cost is looking at how much parking space you need. For me, the priority, and I think maybe shared by most of the board, is public safety. That's my priority, and I know Donna's been concerned about that for decades. It's not safe down there right now with people coming and going and kids running around. And that's my biggest concern. And I think that should be the town's priority, at least initially.
Thanks. Other questions? Jonathan?
Good evening. Nice to see everybody here. Important topic definitely for the future of the island. The only thing I think about when I look at this is why not renegotiate the 76 barging accord with the town of Yarmouth and come up with a long-term solution for your next ferry boat, because the Islanders over 25 years from the newsletters, I think CTC is looking to try to settle it. So you're going to be needing to build the second boat, and even the independence goes backwards instead of forwards because you're still carrying everything by hand, and it's a huge strain. Having an additional parking lot with only 1 or 2 entrances is different than all the cars up the road turning out at the same time. So you have a tremendous amount of congestion that's going to happen at that new parking lot. And you have the same problem with, maybe you have circular flow for the CTC ferry, but I really would suggest that the selectmen look at working with CTC, going to the town of Yarmouth, negotiating the 76 bargaining accord. Because in the long run, I would rather put more money into a car ferry with limits on what, residents can come and go, but that reduces contractor parking. That reduces a lot of things, and it reduces the strain of the parking lot. But the other thing is that from a mariner point of view, that barge lane is the most important thing in that phase 1 and phase 2. The barge lane is the most important thing, not parking cars. It's so expensive to go and create more parking for a parking lot compared to putting the right improvements for long-term use of the barge lane. Thank you.
Because you want to take a shot at where we are, are you up to date on where we are with the DOT conversation relative to the barging? Yeah.
A lot of people in here. So for some of you, I'm sure most of you are aware of the issues that we've been dealing with barging down at Bennett's. So this spring, the town went and hired an engineer called GEI. And what they're doing at the moment is they have gathered information and they're doing an assessment of Bennett's scope and whether it could be permittable through the NERPA permit. And they are currently working with DEP and state officials to determine whether a permanent pier is able to be put in there or not. In the meantime, what they're also doing is they have been provided with a map of other locations on the island. They have driven to other locations on the island, including Sunset, and they're assessing to see if it's not able to be permittable at Bennett's. In addition to that, what are the alternative options for the community if that is not an option? And so the deadline for the temporary ramps that are down there is to have them out on or before December 15th. And so this company is aware of that deadline. And so they are working to try to get that report to us by that time. So then when we have to take those ramps out, we're able to provide some form of an answer to the community in terms of what the option is at Bennett's or whether an alternative option is going to have to be something that has to be looked at.
Thank you. And then to John's other point, John, we have recently gotten feedback from the DOT that any conversations about renegotiating that agreement are a non-starter. We can go to the state government, we can go to the state house and lobby, but it's not as easy as just getting with Yarmouth.
I fully understand. We understand that, but if Yarmouth's going to build like a 56-unit condo unit on the main street of Yarmouth.
Right, so John, we got your point. We don't want to enter into a debate, but I'm trying to answer your question. Thank you.
And I just wanted to mention, to follow up with what Vika said, part of the reason we, are doing this work on Venice Cove is because we recognize that that may affect the project on the Stone Pier. So we're really just trying to get an answer, and I don't want people to assume that we're just doing a permit to install a barge ramp. We're really just trying to get a read on what the option is, because if it's a no, then we may, we may have to look at other things at the Stone Pier. So barging is a big consideration, and we recognize that. And we haven't instructed, this group with Weston and Sampson to kind of make any adjustments relative to barging. That doesn't mean that in the next phase that couldn't happen.
So thanks, John. Other questions?
I have one comment.
Speak up.
So this kind of goes to what John asked about how much to raise it. One of the things that we're looking at is to try to maximize any and every grant opportunity that we have and that is out there. Part of those grant opportunities, and they're looking at sea level rise and sustainability and what we're doing to improve and to be adaptable to the future storms. And so that's something that is is a strong consideration, because that puts us at a higher advantage of having the grants similar to this combination of almost 2 million that we're hoping, or at least $1 million that we're hoping to receive from the state. So that's a big part of it.
So as you think about questions, we have another 15 minutes with Weston Sampson and Woods Hole here. If you have any questions about wave run up, if you have any questions about the modeling that was done, the bathymetry that was surveyed, because the state didn't get us to us when they said they were going to, this would be a good time to ask those questions. So Pam, please.
So thank you, everyone, for all of the work in this. My question is about updated costs. The last cost I noticed was from 2022. And a lot has happened in terms of building costs since then. So are there updated costs for this, or is it something for other states?
I would agree with your statement about 2022 costs have certainly changed. Not only are we looking at inflation, but really the effect of the pandemic, not just on labor, but material costs. So certainly there has been a significant increase in construction, particularly marine construction. So as far as next steps, we do be part of the next step through preliminary design efforts to start getting our arms wrapped around what those costs look like. So that's to be determined, but certainly at the forefront of the next phase that we'll be entering into.
Other questions? Let's let everybody go once before we have people repeat, unless there are no other questions. So please, Donna.
This is. So in the next phase, what you, I guess it's the chicken and the egg, the cart before the horse. How can we as a community decide if we want to go forward towards the 30% idea if we don't have an idea about money?
Right.
And I think the design that we saw from Ray Pierce, which was a ballpark cost in 2022, was probably beyond our capacity, partly because it was not a phase design. So I think where we're going now is trying to come up with a design that is, as they said, it's adaptable, and then hit a threshold that the community can, achieve financially on the short term. So it's probably, I think, going to be a compromise between cost and resiliency. And I think we may we just need to know what we're, you know, accepting in terms of sort of a risk-based design. So that's what I see the decision process. Hope that we can populate the finance committee is to really start looking at these long-term fiscal needs, because this is not the only project. We've got a number of other projects on should be that relate, a lot of them relate to climate resiliency. So I think we need to get, you know, a picture of all take one. And part of the survey that, you know, that you're, that's out right now is really asking the question, you know, about what you know, what people's comfort level is with potentially having to pay more taxes to do some of this. So the Stone Pier project in itself is challenging. Some of which, you know, we also have to address. So I think it's really gonna come out in the next phase, sort of some cost information that's attached to a specific design, and if we determine that that's too high, we're gonna have to go back and adjust the design, and, you know, figure out, just like when you build a house. I mean, I don't know, everybody's gone through a house construction project, you know, you sometimes have to go back and redesign because you can't afford what you'd like to have. So that's where we'll be as a community, so it's gonna take probably some back and forth during that phase, and we're hoping that phase will occur in the next 6 to 12 months.
I would add to Carol's comment and, the house building analogy. We really need to come out the financial aspect of this in two directions. I think one direction is from engineering people telling us and construction people telling us what a given approach is going to cost. But I think it's incumbent on our community to tell them, here's the range of what we think we can spend over a given time frame. That's why that's one of the reasons we formed a capital committee, or a finance committee, I should say, on the town. And if anybody's interested, we still need one more member on the finance committee to kick off some of that work.
It's going to say one other thing to bring it home. It's not unusual that these types of projects are iterative. It's just the nature of the projects. But what I'd like to say is the work that has been done so far has really laid the groundwork for the next phase to move us into answering a lot of these questions for your folks. So we're ready to move forward, and there's going to be some hard decisions to be made. These things take a little time, but the community input is a valued piece of this process. But it's not unusual that we're trying to solve problems like this through an iterative approach. Cost is always something at the forefront of this mind.
And one thing I'll add is that there's a lot of federal and state money, grant-based money out there if you're building resilience into your infrastructure. Why? Because look what just happened in North Carolina, right? It's not resilient, the damages are 10 times recovery what you do if you just push forward with resilience. So they want you to build resilience. That doesn't mean you have to build it, you know, at 2,200 something crazy, right? Just show that you're trying to build resilience, especially in critical infrastructure like we have here, right? This is your lifeline. This is how you get to and from the island. So I think there's money out there to help you guys through the process.
Okay, I already have the microphone.
You can stand up and walk forward.
It's mine now.
And I'm getting way ahead, but I was just curious, because, you know, if everything goes forward and we have phase one and we're having all this construction done on the stone wharf, which it desperately needs, what's access to get on and off the island during that process? I mean, I'm put up with it, you know, but, you know, emergency services, what's access gonna look like?
I think the simple answer is, those things are considered as we start moving forward, because they're very important questions that need to be answered. What happens during construction? How do you maintain your access? So all of those things are one more variable that we have to consider, in this equation of solving the puzzle. And I will add to, Kurt's grant opportunities and just substantiate, by commenting that the grants that are out there, there are many. But going back to the building blocks that this team has put together is putting the town in the best position possible to successfully go after those grant opportunities. So again, trying to have a forward thinking approach. We don't know how much things are going to cost, but the work that's being done is putting the town in a position to be a strong contender for those grants.
So real quick to add to that, in addition, the experiment that we did a few weeks back at the Stone Pier, a lot of those steps were in line with the phase one approach and what some of those changes could be. And so now, last night was the first time that it came back to the board for discussion. It is going to be in the next couple of meetings again for discussion. So I would really encourage all of you to participate in that process, because that input from all of you about what you think could be helpful or efficient, or the ideas of how we can move towards that phase approach, is what is really needed to make it a successful process.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I think Mary has her hand up.
5-minute warning.
I'm happy to talk from here if I can. I can try to get up there.
Go ahead and say that.
Okay. It's difficult for me. I am going to just pretty much restate in my own words what Donna shared earlier. We have a property that the town owns that would provide or meet the needs for transportation, parking, and barging. It would be a safe place, and it's isolated from all the other traffic. A bus wouldn't be needed, or people would have plenty of parking there. The natural elevation of that property would solve issues relative to climate change. We have to think about that. It would certainly serve as I said, barging, transportation, and parking. The work that we have now is certainly significant in our community, and it could continue to serve the fishermen. It won't have to be so high from their work that it makes it inconvenient for them. Just wanted to say it's very important. We're going to be spending a lot of time and money on research, and we should be. But we can't just stop thinking about that. We must address the fact that we have a property that could be worked on as our current work continues to be used. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for electing me. It's been in my short time on the board, I really have come to respect the work that has been done by past board members and the work that's going on now. None of these questions there's so many more questions, but I want to say, if you're interested in barging, we still have spots available on the solid waste committee and cannot meet until there's a quorum. And so please, we need help on that. And boy, do we need help on that finance committee, because the more our select board can be working with the finance committee to understand these numbers, it takes a lot, it creates a greater fund of wisdom for all of us. So please think about joining the finance committee and pitching in on that solid waste committee so that we can move forward with some solutions that people talk about. Thank you.
I think this will be the last question of the night, so these guys can go.
I just want to say that many, many decades ago, Topeka spent a lot of time, money, and effort to build the stone. And we owe it to the next generation to spend the money that is needed and to make it so that our grandchildren can keep coming here and have an access to the mainland.
Okay. That's a wrap.